What's going on, guys? It's Fight Season MMA, and today I want to make a video talking about my top 10 BMF fighters in the UFC. If you all know, at UFC 300, UFC 291, there was a BMF title fight, and you can go look up what that means if you don't know what it does, but these are the baddest men in the entire UFC organization. These are the fighters that take fights on 2 days' notice. These are the fighters that take fights just going into it and not expecting to win, but do it because they are hungry and they have that motivation to go get it done. These are the fighters that no one wants to face and the fighters that are the fan favorites inside the UFC organization. If you guys enjoyed the UFC content, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. That is the best way to show support to the channel. Also, please go down and hit the subscribe button. We are on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and it would mean so much if you guys went down there and showed your support by smashing the subscribe button. But let's jump into the top 10 BMF fighters in the UFC right now. At number 10 for my top 10 BMF fighters, I have Dan 50K Ige. Dan Ige is a BMF because he stepped in to fight Diego Lopez at UFC 303 on 2 hours notice, one of the shortest fight times, probably the shortest fight notice on the entire UFC career. That man woke up that morning, didn't know he was fighting at UFC 303, and texted Hunter Campbell and Dana White saying that I can step in to save this fight with Diego Lopez. And that is an absolutely crazy thing to do. Dan Ige has had some amazing fights in the UFC. That fight with Nate Landwehr was crazy. He's got that fight with Andre Fili where he knocked Fili out cold. And he's got so many other fights in the organization that have proved that he's in there to stand and bang and truly be a BMF. Dan Ige is a definition of a BMF. He will fight anyone, anywhere, at any time, and do everything he can to get that win. And that is 100% why I have Dan Ige at number 10 on my list. At number 9, I have Alexander the Great Volkanovski. Alexander Volkanovski is a fighting machine. This man fights at least 3 times a year. He's currently off of the UFC right now, just taking a break because he's got knocked out in his last 2 fights. But prior to that, he fought at UFC 298. He fought at UFC 294. He fought at UFC 290. He fought at UFC 284, 276, 273, and 266, I believe. And that's such an active fighting resume and career inside the UFC. He will take a fight anywhere, anytime. He stepped in on 2 weeks' notice to fight the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in Islam Makhachev at UFC 294. He fought Islam Makhachev up a weight class when no one thought he could possibly stand a chance, and almost beat Islam at UFC 284. And there were so many different fights inside the UFC where Alexander Volkanovski has been considered a BMF. There's so many memes on Twitter of a fighter pulling out in any weight class, and you already know Alexander Volkanovski will go in there to take that fight. Volkanovski is the definition of a true fighter that will go in and step in in a fight on any time, anywhere, and any length of notice, and that is why Volkanovski falls at my number 9 spot on my top 10 BMFs in the UFC currently. Number 8 of my top 10 BMF fighters at the UFC currently, I have Dustin the Diamond Poirier. Dustin Poirier is the definition of a bad BMF. That man steps in to fight anyone on any time and any notice. He fought Benoit Saint-Denis, an up-and-coming hungry prospect at UFC 299, and knocked him out cold. He went toe-to-toe with Islam Makhachev, the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the UFC, where a lot of people thought he would get absolutely killed, and Islam was a minus 600 favorite going into that fight. There's so many different fighters in the UFC who do not want to fight Dustin Poirier due to his resume, his just bulldog-like mentality, and that experience that he possesses inside the UFC. Dustin Poirier fights like an absolute madman in there. He doesn't go in there thinking he's going to be alive the next day, and he is a fan favorite among all UFC fighters, and that is why a lot of the fans cherish every single fight that Dustin Poirier has. His career is going to be coming to an end here very, very soon. He says he's probably got one more fight left in the tank, unless if he's going to be able to gather that title run yet again. But Dustin Poirier, for his accolades, his time fighting, and the people he's fought, is easily number 8 on my top 10 BMF fighters in the UFC currently. At number 7, my top 10 BMF fighters is Diego Lopez. Diego Lopez's first fight in the UFC, if you guys remember, it was only against someone named Movsar Evloev, who is the number 6, 5, or 4 ranked UFC flyweight right now, and he took that fight on 5 days' notice in the main card of UFC 288 and gave Movsar a run for his money. That was an incredible fight by Diego Lopez right there, and no one else has tested Movsar Evloev to that standard, and he fought Arnold Allen right thereafter, and Diego Lopez did better on 5 days' notice. notice. Also at UFC 303, he took a fight with Brian Ortega on 2 days' notice. Then he went in. Brian Ortega had to pull out of the fight because of a fever after cutting weight, because he was weighing too much prior to the fight and his body was under so much stress. So what did Diego Lopez do? He accepted a fight with Dan Ige on 3 hours notice after the UFC said that they would pay him for his time going in and making weight and whatnot. But he still wanted to fight for the fans because he says he wants to be the person who is known to fight anywhere at any time with anyone. And that is the reason that Diego Lopez is at number 7 on this list. There is not that many fighters who would change opponent on 3 hours notice. Someone who didn't have to cut weight and someone who's stepping in that he has no game plan for to just go in there and scrap with some dangerous person like Dan 50K Ige. Ultimately, Diego Lopez 100% deserves the number 7 spot on this list. At number 6 on my top 10 BMF fighters in the UFC currently, I have Justin the Highlight Gaethje. Justin Gaethje is your favorite fighter's favorite fighter. He has some absolutely insane knockouts out of some crazy individuals like Dustin Poirier at UFC 291 to hold the BMF title. He also defended the BMF title, the first person to ever do it in the UFC currently, against Max Holloway, where he ended up losing that fight. He also has knocked out with the likes of Michael Johnson, Donald Cerrone, and so many different fighters where he is absolutely insane. What's funny is when Justin Gaethje came to the UFC, he just liked to fight and he just liked to brawl, and now he's actually added technique, which wasn't there originally. Justin Gaethje is one of those fighters where he goes in there and swings for the fences to get the knockout. You look at the Charles Oliveira fight, Justin Gaethje was swinging himself off of his feet in that fight to go try to knock out Charles Oliveira. That fight with Michael Chandler, Justin Gaethje put on an absolute masterclass on Chandler, which was an amazing thing going into that fight. The Rafael Fiziev fight was a fighter who was coming up, a very dangerous opponent who I still believe highly in Rafael Fiziev. And Justin Gaethje went and dismantled him in the second and third rounds handily. Ultimately, Justin Gaethje, the former BMF title holder, is 100% deserving to be on this list, and I have him slotted in at number 6. At number 5 of my top 10 BMF fighters in the UFC organization right now, I have Robert the Reaper Whittaker. And Robert Whittaker took a fight with Khamzat Chimaev in Saudi Arabia to where he wanted to go and show and prove himself against one of the best up-and-comers in the UFC. He has not fought a middleweight after he moved up to the middleweight division. He was going to fight Paulo Costa, Khamzat Chimaev, but he pulled out. So Kamaru Usman stepped in. So Robert Whittaker wanted to be the first person to fight Khamzat in the UFC middleweight division, really in the top 15. But that fight ended up getting canceled. Robert Whittaker took a fight with Ikram Iliskerov on 1 week notice and knocked him out in 2 minutes. So then what does Robert Whittaker do? Does he demand a title shot? Nope. He wants to fight Khamzat again and show them to derail the UFC's plans. That is true BMF movement right there, where he is going in there to fight anyone, anywhere on a date that the UFC has scheduled. UFC 308 is a date in Abu Dhabi where Khamzat Chimaev is only fighting right now. He's only fighting in the Middle East, so Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. And Robert Whittaker wanted to fly there again to fight over in Abu Dhabi, so Khamzat Chimaev could be the opponent. Ultimately, Robert Whittaker is taking on one of the toughest challenges in the UFC, a challenge that Kamaru Usman couldn't face, even though it was 10 days notice. So Robert Whittaker needs to have a lot of props and being a BMF to truly fight anyone at anywhere at any time, and that is why Robert Whittaker is number 5 on the list. At number 4 of my top 10 BMF fighters list, that is Kevin Holland. Kevin Holland is the most active fighter in the UFC organization. That is followed right behind Alex Pereira. Kevin Holland has had 16 fights in 3 years, or some number like that. It might be 11 fights or 5. I don't know exactly, but Kevin Holland has had so many fights in the past couple years, which makes him the most active fighter in the UFC. It's a fight every about 90 days or so for Kevin Holland. But Kevin Holland has fought so many different individuals. He's headlined events versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. He's fought Michael Chiesa. He stepped in and fought Michael Venom Cage, a prospect coming over from Bellator, who was an older guy, but we didn't know how he was going to do in the UFC. Stepped up and fought him. He fought Jack Della Maddalena on a couple weeks' notice. He's fought some amazing fighters in the UFC, and truly is the definition of fighting anyone, anytime, and anywhere. Kevin Holland goes for the knockout every time. He loves to swing. He had an agreement with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson to see if he was the better striker, so he would end up taking him down and let him stand up immediately in that fight, which is something that isn't that smart, but it's a true BMF because Stephen Wonderboy Thompson is an undefeated Taekwondo fighter prior to coming over to the UFC. Ultimately, Kevin Holland's activity, strength of schedule, and just fight anyone, anytime, and anywhere mentality makes him a true BMF and number 4 in my list. At number 3, top 10 BMF fighters in the UFC is Dan the Hangman Hooker. Dan Hooker just fought this weekend at UFC 305, and if you look at that clip in the corner of him just saying that he loves fighting when he's bleeding and his hair is dyed red because it's blonde from the blood, is absolutely insane to me. Dan Hooker is a real human being going in there just saying that he loves to fight, and that's it. He's had some absolute wars inside the UFC. He went toe-to-toe with prime Dustin Poirier at 155 and in a controversial decision that Dustin Poirier won, which Dan Hooker had a chance of actually winning. He's fought the likes of Jalen Turner, where he only broke his arm and broke his orbital in that fight, to then come back and win in the final round. Dan Hooker is one of the toughest fighters in the UFC, to where he has gone through so much pain in there, and to have the mental fortitude to go in there and win some of these fights is absolutely insane. To do it in front of his home crowd in Perth this past weekend was nuts. To go in there and beat Mateusz Gamrot, a fight that he was an incredible underdog in, and to do it in that kind of fashion where he loved every minute of it, and to jump up that much in the rankings as a true BMF in standard. He was scheduled to fight Bobby Green at UFC Austin last year, but he had to pull out with that fight because his arm was still broken, and he was trying to train with a broken arm to fight Bobby Green to push himself up in the rankings. Ultimately, Dan Hooker is one of the baddest people in the UFC, and he loves fighting, which makes it so fun, and everyone loves watching the Hangman fight. At number 2 on my top 10 BMF fighters list is none other than Alex Poatan Pereira. Alex Pereira has saved the last 4 UFC events that he's fought in. UFC 295, John Jones pulled out. He stepped up to be the main event, knocking out Yuri Prochazka in the second round. UFC 300 didn't have a clear-cut main event. He took on Jamal Hill, who was supposed to be one of Alex's toughest challenges in the UFC, on about 6 weeks' notice, and he knocked Jamal Hill out in the first round. UFC 303. There was a main event, Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, and Conor McGregor pulled out with about 2 weeks left in the fight. So what happened? Alex Pereira fought Yuri Prochazka on 2 weeks' notice, knocking him out with 5 seconds into the second round, and now there was no clear-cut main event for UFC 307. Alex Pereira clearly stated that he wanted to take some time off of the UFC and return in December or January, but Alex Pereira is back to fight Khalil Roundtree Jr. at UFC 307 on October 7th, which is an absolute crazy thing from Alex Pereira saying that he wants time off to stepping back in there almost 3 months earlier than he previously presumed is absolutely BMF movement. Everyone loves watching Poatan fight. He has so many different memes. The word Shama is going around the UFC crazy right now, and everyone thinks Alex Pereira is one of the baddest fighters in the UFC for his just absolute killer mentality in there of how he steps in to fight any fighter, anytime, anywhere, good, bad, old, young. Alex Pereira is one of the baddest fighters on the UFC in the entire planet. Thank you so much for watching my top 10 BMF fighters in the UFC right now. These are the baddest men on the planet. These fighters do anything for the UFC, fighting at any time, anywhere, at any place, any opponent, just to make sure that their legacy and their careers are fulfilled, creating some of the biggest moments in UFC history. You look at Max Holloway's fight with Justin Gaethje. That was absolutely crazy too. Crazy individuals for fighting each other. Alex Pereira saving so many cards. Kevin Holland being the most active fighter in the UFC. Robert Whittaker asking to fight Hamzat. Diego Lopez and Dan Ige taking a fight against one another on 2 hours notice. You got someone like Alexander Volkanovski stepping in to fight so many different individuals. And you got Dustin Poirier being one of the craziest fighters in the UFC, fighting anyone at any time. And Dan Hooker being that guy in there who just loves getting punched in the face. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. This is absolutely amazing if you can do that. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We're almost there. We're getting really close, and please go down there and hit the post notification button just so you guys can always stay up to date with the latest UFC content in the community right now. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and please enjoy the video, and I will see you guys very soon.